York, this is Democracy Now!
So I'm here to report we are very much alive. And make no mistake about it, this campaign will send Donald Trump packing. This campaign is taking off.
But we are not only taking on the corporate establishment, we're taking on the political establishment. But we're going to win because the people understand it is our campaign, our movement, which is best positioned to defeat Trump.
And then there was two. With 14 states at stake, Joe Biden takes 9, including delegate-rich Texas. Sanders won Colorado, Utah, Vermont, and the Associated Press has declared him the winner of the grand prize of the largest delegate state, California. Joe Biden surged among African-American voters in the South. Bernie Sanders dominated the Latino vote. We'll speak with Sanders organizer Chuck Rocha. He's been called the architect of Sanders' campaign strategy to mobilize Latinx voters. And we'll host a round table on the African-American vote with historian and activist Barbara Ransby, the Reverend Dr. William Barber, co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign, and the nation's Elie Mystal. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The biggest voting day of the Democratic presidential primary campaign has ended in a two-person race between former Vice President Joe Biden and Senator Bernie Sanders. On Super Tuesday, Biden swept the South and Midwest, winning Virginia, North Carolina, Arkansas, Alabama, Tennessee, Oklahoma, Massachusetts, Minnesota, and Texas, propelled by a huge majority of African-American voters in southern states. Meanwhile, Bernie Sanders won his home state of Vermont and scored victories in the West, winning Colorado and Utah. And according to the Associated Press, Sanders won the grand prize of the night, California, with significant Latinx support. Biden's strong showing came after the Democratic Party establishment consolidated around the former vice president, with Amy Klobuchar and Pete Buttigieg dropping out in recent days, and they're throwing their support behind Biden. This is Joe Biden speaking in Los Angeles last night.
Well, I'm here to report we are very much alive. And make no mistake about it, this campaign will send Donald Trump packing. This campaign is taking off. Join us.
Senator Bernie Sanders' biggest win came in California, where Latinx voters account for nearly 40% of the population. Sanders spoke last night from his home state of Vermont.
We have two major goals in front of us, and they are directly related. First, we must beat a president who apparently has never read the Constitution of the United States. A president who thinks we should be an autocracy, not a democracy. But second of all, we need a movement and are developing a movement of black, white, Latino, Native American, Asian American, gay and straight. Of people who are making it clear every day they will not tolerate the grotesque level of income and wealth inequality we are experiencing.
Senator Elizabeth Warren finished in third place in her home state of Massachusetts. Billionaire and former Republican New York City Mayor Mike Bloomberg said he planned to reassess his candidacy after he spent more than $500 million to score just one victory. in American Samoa, where he won 5 delegates. Tulsi Gabbard picked up 1 delegate there in American Samoa. In down-ballot races, Republican Jeff Sessions will face a runoff election in Alabama on March 31st in his bid to reclaim the Senate seat he vacated to become President Trump's attorney general before Trump fired him in 2018. Sessions will face off against former Auburn University football coach Tommy Tuberville for the right to take on Democratic Senator Doug Jones in November. In Texas, incumbent Democratic Congressmember Henry Cuellar appears to have narrowly defeated Democratic Socialist Jessica Cisneros to hold on to Texas' 28th congressional district along the U.S.-Mexico border. Cisneros, who was endorsed by the AFL-CIO, Bernie Sanders, and Elizabeth Warren, is a supporter of Medicare for All and the Green New Deal. Cuellar is pro-gun, anti-choice, and has backed private prisons, drone surveillance, and increased border security. In California, San Diego Councilwoman Georgette Gomez is one of 2 candidates who will square off in November for the 53rd Congressional District. Gomez is a progressive Democrat backed by Senator Sanders and New York Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, vying to become the first queer Latina elected to Congress. She'll square off in November against Sarah Jacobs, a former aide to Hillary Clinton and granddaughter of billionaire Qualcomm founder Irwin Jacobs. Jacobs' campaign is being heavily supported by a super PAC set up by her grandparents. After headlines, we'll spend the rest of the hour analyzing Super Tuesday's results. The World Health Organization said Tuesday the global death rate from the disease caused by the new coronavirus is 3.4%, far deadlier than the seasonal flu. The warning came as the number of coronavirus deaths outside China surpassed the number inside China for the first time. Washington State Tuesday reported another coronavirus death, the 9th in the region. In New York, Mayor Bill de Blasio said Tuesday a Manhattan lawyer has become the 2nd person in the city to test positive for the new coronavirus.
So this individual that you've been hearing about is the new nexus to some particular activity. He is the first patient who required hospitalization in New York City since the coronavirus issue began. He is the first patient to be seriously ill.
Officials have closed 2 separate schools in the Bronx attended by the patient's sons. So far, they've not tested positive. 2 other schools in New York's northern suburbs are also closed out of what officials called an abundance of caution. The Wall Street Journal reports the Trump administration is considering using a national disaster program to cover the cost of treating coronavirus in some of the 27 million Americans without health coverage. The nation's largest union of registered nurses, National Nurses United, Tuesday called the nation's public health system woefully unprepared for the pandemic and demanded once a vaccine is developed, it should be made free to the public. Elsewhere, Chile and Argentina recorded their first coronavirus cases, while the death toll in Iran jumped to 92. On Wall Street, the Dow Jones dropped nearly 800 points Tuesday on new fears about the virus toll on the global economy. Tuesday's stock market drop came even though the Federal Reserve ordered a 0.5 percentage point cut to interest rates. In Syria, Turkey's military shot down a Syrian fighter jet over southern Idlib on Tuesday. It was the 3rd such downing of a Syrian warplane in recent days. Elsewhere, forces loyal to Syrian President Bashar al-Assad retook control of Sarkib, a strategic city at the crossroads of 2 major highways in northwest Syria. Human rights groups say Syria's Russian-backed offensive in Idlib province has killed at least 300 civilians, while internally displacing nearly 1 million residents who've been forced into squalid camps near the Turkish border. This week, a UN investigation found Russia is directly responsible for war crimes in Idlib after the Russian Air Force targeted civilian areas for indiscriminate bombings, including hospitals. Amnesty International reports Iranian security forces shot and killed at least 23 children during a crackdown on anti-government protests in November. Among those struck and killed by live ammunition was a girl who may have been as young as 8 years old. Security forces killed many as 1,500 unarmed demonstrators and bystanders during the November protests, which were sparked by a sharp increase in gas prices. The rising fuel costs came amidst devastating sanctions imposed by the U.S. after President Trump withdrew from the Iran nuclear deal. Back in the United States, powerful tornadoes ripped through Tennessee early Tuesday morning, killing at least 25 people in the Nashville area. Governor William Lee toured the devastation.
I spent the day touring and visiting with victims and walking through neighborhoods, and the devastation is heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking. It's incredible. Our prayers are greatly needed for families out there who are dealing with a sudden tragic event that has occurred in our state.
The deadly storm came as voters prepared to take to the polls for the state's primary. Over a dozen polling stations in Tennessee were damaged before voting began yesterday. In more climate news, Wells Fargo has ruled out investing in oil and gas drilling in the Arctic, making it the third major U.S. bank to withdraw support for fossil fuel projects in the ecologically delicate region. The Sierra Club Tuesday hailed Wells Fargo's pledge, but warned the shift does not make improvements to the bank's other oil and gas financing policies. This comes as the Trump administration is pushing forward with plans to open the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge to drilling. A top Democratic lawmaker is demanding answers from a secretive artificial intelligence company over its sale of facial recognition technology to repressive regimes, including Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. Massachusetts Senator Ed Markey sent a letter to Clearview AI on Tuesday demanding information about the company's database of billions of images scraped from Facebook and other social media sites. Senator Markey wrote, quote, "The use of sophisticated facial recognition technology is concerning even in a democracy with strong civil liberties, but its export to certain foreign countries could enable mass surveillance and repression of minorities," he wrote. In recent days, students at 36 U.S. universities held protests against administrators' plans to use facial recognition on their campuses. CNN reports Trump's new personnel chief is distributing questionnaires to potential political appointees to verify their loyalty to President Trump. As part of the Trump litmus tests, candidates must explain what part of Trump's campaign, quote, most appealed to them. The campaign to identify and purge anti-Trump staffers is being led by 29-year-old John McEntee, whom Trump recently appointed head of the Presidential Personnel Office. Before he was rehired this year, McEntee was fired in 2018 by then Chief of Staff General John Kelly because he was under federal investigation for financial crimes. Virginia Governor Ralph Northam signed a bill Tuesday outlawing a so-called conversion therapy, a pseudoscientific practice that seeks to coerce LGBTQ youth into renouncing their sexual orientation. When the new law takes effect in July, Virginia will become the first southern state and the 20th in the United States to ban the practice, which has been rejected by mental health professionals for decades. A study last year by the suicide prevention organization The Trevor Project found LGBTQ youth who had undergone conversion therapy were more than twice as likely to attempt suicide as those who do not. Author and reporter Ronan Farrow has slammed his publisher, Hachette, after it announced it would publish Woody Allen's forthcoming memoir. Farrow said the decision, quote, shows a lack of ethics and compassion for victims of sexual abuse, unquote, and announced he was cutting ties with the publisher. In 2017, Ronan Farrow published a piece in The New Yorker detailing abuse by recently convicted rapist, former Hollywood mogul Harvey Weinstein. The article is widely considered to be a watershed moment in the Me Too movement. Last year, Hachette published Farrow's book, Catch and Kill, which details the challenges he faced investigating Weinstein and other powerful media figures accused of sexual assault. Ronan Farrow is also the brother of Dylan Farrow, who has accused Woody Allen of sexually abusing her as a child when he was her adoptive father. Allen has denied those allegations. And in Mexico, feminists are calling for a national strike March 9th, one day after International Women's Day, to protest skyrocketing gender-based violence in Mexico. Calls for a national strike are being led by the Mexican feminist group Witches of the Sea. The strike has been referred to as a day without us, calling on women not to go to work or to school, to stay out of the streets, and to avoid participating in the economy in any way for 24 hours. This is a member of Witches of the Sea, Arusianda.
Yo creo que las mujeres en México estamos...
I believe that women in Mexico are tired of the different types of violence that are committed against us in all spaces. It is not only a femicide crisis, but also the day-to-day, in homes, in schools, on the street, on the job. It seems that there is no place that is safe for us.
Plans for the national strike gained momentum after the brutal murders in February of 25-year-old Ingrid Escamilla, who was killed and mutilated by her partner, and 7-year-old Fatima, who was kidnapped and later found dead wrapped in a plastic bag. In Mexico, at least 10 women are killed every day. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Juan Gonzalez. Welcome to all of our listeners and viewers across the country and around the world. The biggest voting day of the Democratic presidential primary campaign has ended in a two-person race between two candidates, former Vice President Joe Biden and Senator Bernie Sanders. With more than a third of the delegates at stake, Biden swept the Midwest and the South, winning Virginia, North Carolina, Arkansas, Alabama, Tennessee, Oklahoma, Massachusetts, Minnesota, and delegate-rich Texas. Sanders saw victories in Colorado and Utah, and the Associated Press reports he is the winner of the grand prize of the night, the largest delegate state of California. He also won his home state of Vermont. Massachusetts Senator Elizabeth Warren finished in an embarrassing third place in her home state, and New York billionaire Mike Bloomberg said he planned to reassess his candidacy after he spent more than $500 million to score just one victory in American Samoa. Biden delivered his victory speech in Los Angeles, where he was interrupted when two protesters with Direct Action Everywhere stormed the stage, chanting, "Let Dairy Die." He began his address with a much-talked-about gaffe.
It's a good night. It's a good night. And it seems to be getting even better. They don't call Super Tuesday for nothing. By the way, this is my little sister, Valerie, and I'm Jill's husband. Oh, no, this is oh, you switched on me. This is my wife. This is my sister. They switched on me. Folks, it's still early, but things are looking awful, awful good. So I'm here to report we are very much alive. And make no mistake about it. This campaign will send Donald Trump packing. This campaign is taking off. Join us.
Meanwhile, Bernie Sanders used his speech at the end of Super Tuesday in his home state of Vermont to contrast his record with Biden and President Donald Trump.
But we are not only taking on the corporate establishment, we're taking on the political establishment. But we're going to win because the people understand it is our campaign, our movement, which is best positioned to defeat Trump. You cannot beat Trump with the same old kind of politics.
Sanders' biggest win came in California. MSNBC and CNN aren't calling it, but the Associated Press is. He won the support of some 55% of Latinx voters, who account for nearly 40% of California's population. His campaign had 23 field offices in California alone. The Latinx community in Texas also showed up in droves for Sanders, with 39% of the vote, compared to Biden, who received 26%, though Texas went to Joe Biden. Latinx voters could also play a key role in states' upcoming primaries in Arizona and Florida. For more, we go to Washington, D.C., where we're joined once again by Chuck Rocha. He's senior advisor to Senator Bernie Sanders' presidential campaign. He's been called the architect of Sanders' campaign strategy to mobilize Latinx voters. Welcome back to Democracy Now! So let's begin with the big numbers. You've got Joe Biden winning 9 states, including, well, your home state of delegate-rich Texas. You've got Bernie Sanders winning, well, 4 states, if you include California, which AP has called the largest, the delegate-rich state of California. But this is really being called a victory for Joe Biden. They're talking about Joe-mentum because of his surge, especially among Southern African-American voters. Chuck Rocha, your analysis of what happened on Super Tuesday.
There's no doubt that Joe Biden had a good night last night, but I would argue that Bernie Sanders had a good night. This is not about who wins what state. All of your people that are watching this great program know that it's about the delegate count. And once we get done counting California, we'll be very close to where Joe Biden is, much like when we came into this race. And we learned a lot last night. Anybody who's worth their weight in salt will know that what you do now is you back up, you see where you did really well. You alluded to the amazing operation we've been running for now months and months in the Latino community and places where we need to improve. We'll reevaluate that now. We'll look towards the states that are coming up to make sure that we continue to put our shoulder against the wheel and empower all those grassroots activists out there that really make the difference in this campaign. Let's talk about one big loser last night, and that was the folks running the election system. I get sick and tired of watching good folks stand in line for hours and hours trying to represent democracy by voting. Voting in this country should not be that hard. At the richest country, at the richest point in history, we should make it easy for folks to vote, and they don't have to stand in line sometimes for 3 or 4 hours. I found that whole process disgusting last night.
Chuck, I wanted to ask you specifically about Texas. From what I can tell, there was maybe about twice as many people who voted in this primary for president in Texas as did in 2016. But clearly, Texas has different. It's a huge state. In East Texas, there's a large African-American community in places like Houston, obviously a little further north in Dallas. What's your sense of how the turnout and also how the state broke down versus what you expected versus what actually happened?
Well, the one thing I will say for sure is the Latino vote almost single-handedly carried the state for Bernie Sanders. But overall, if you look at the African-American vote and the Latino vote, you had Bernie Sanders, who had done all this work in that community. We'd been there, spent millions of dollars, empowered that community. You had an African-American community that was very, very much ginned up for Joe Biden. But overall, what I've been seeing all the way back to the last midterm elections is this anxiety with people of color and in minority communities around Donald Trump. I think Donald Trump is motivating lots of folks in diverse communities who feel threatened. There's lots of Latinos with brown skin like me who are U.S. citizens who feel like we've been demagogued by this president, treated like a second-class citizen. That's why you see a lot of energy out there, and I think Bernie Sanders is capturing some of that. And to give credit where credit's due, Joe Biden has captured some of that as well.
And would you say the big loser of the night appears to have been Michael Bloomberg, who staked his entire $500 million on being able to avoid the early states and then score big victories on Super Tuesday? That just didn't happen.
Well, there's some political consultants down in Texas that's already started building their second house on the amount of money they made with Michael Bloomberg. I'll promise you that. And he threw a lot of money away in lots of states and spent lots of time in lots of places. And it just didn't work out for him. It just goes to show that you can't go in and buy an election. You can't go in and try to duplicate something like our grassroots movement by paying activists on the ground. Anybody's welcome to run for president, but he stands against everything we stand for in the Bernie Sanders campaign of raising donations, $5 at a time, and empowering regular Americans to be a part of this process.
So NBC is reporting, Chuck, that Biden won the support of 63% of black voters in Virginia, 62% of black voters in Tennessee, 72% of black voters in Alabama. Exit polls show 6 in 10 black voters back Biden in Texas and North Carolina. According to NBC exit poll, black voters outside the South were less likely to support Biden. Black voters under 45 around 3 times as likely to support Bernie Sanders than voters. If you can talk, I mean, you are a main architect of the Latino strategy, but you're part of a team that is really also focusing on African-American strategy. It's also interesting that Simone Sanders, who was one of Bernie Sanders' top people, is now one of the top people for Joe Biden, and she's, of course, African-American.
Well, let's not forget that Joe Biden was the vice president of Barack Obama, the first black president who made history, who was an amazing president, who is still the most popular figure in Democratic politics. So there is a piece to overcome there with that piece. That don't mean you give up on that vote and you walk away. When I started this telecast, I said, you step back now and you evaluate what you did and you reassess and you change your strategy. We continue to do well with young African Americans, but we can always do better with older African Americans. These folks have come and literally are the backbone of this party, especially black women, and we want to lift up their voices and make sure they have a part of this campaign and that we're doing this in the right way. So I think we can always improve.
And Chuck, I wanted to ask you, obviously, whoever is going to be the nominee of the Democratic Party has to get 50% or more of the delegates to be nominated. So far, if you look at Biden actually got more than 50% of the vote, I think, in 2 states on Tuesday, and Bernie won in Vermont, just over 50% of the vote there. How do you see a path to getting more than 50% of the vote? Because when you add up even the Warren folks, if you're looking at the so-called progressive camp, if you add up the Warren votes and the Sanders vote, in many of these states, they don't quite come to 50%. So how do you see the path to actual nomination?
Well, there's a lot of big states coming up, right? And so there's everything in this. If you've watched this primary from the beginning, and I've been on this particular race over a year and was with Senator Sanders back in 2015, things change quickly. And you're going to have debates. You're going to have chances for people to back up now. The whole field has consolidated down. So all of that is a strategic decision on resource allocation and where you're really doubling down in certain states. With big states coming up, like Washington State that we won last time, Michigan, Missouri, then you start looking at Florida and Arizona, and oh my goodness, Pennsylvania, New York, and all these Midwestern states. There's all these different strategies that go in. One thing that you should keep your eye on is that Midwest area with lots of blue-collar, African-American, Latino, white folks who work in unions, all of the above, and around this issue of jobs and trains. A lot of these people have been hoodwinked by President Trump, and they're looking for an alternative now that they see that he ain't quite right. They want somebody that they can believe in, and Bernie Sanders has stood with them against every trade deal that sent all of their jobs overseas.
Now, the next group of states, almost a dozen, the majority of them went to Hillary Clinton over Bernie Sanders in 2016, which is why, although he won California, this is not winner-take-all state, and as none of them are. And so they're going to come out around even on the delegates. But he wanted a big cushion from California because of what's coming up next, not possibly favorable to him. Do you have that same assessment?
I don't, because we did really well in Washington, and we did really well where we shocked people in Michigan last time. So there's 2 states that coming up immediately that the senator is very popular in. And looking down the road, this is just not the same race. And I just talked about a whole new group of people being motivated to come out because of the undertow of Donald Trump. We're going to fight for every single vote. What really makes us different is our fundraising apparatus with our grassroots activists and those activists making phone calls and knocking on doors. We're fixing to rotate now from the Deep South up to working in the Midwest and some of these western states with New York and Pennsylvania. We feel really good about all those states and our grassroots activism in those states.
We want to thank you so much for being with us. Chuck Rocha, senior advisor to Senator Bernie Sanders' presidential campaign. When we come back, we look at Biden's decisive victory with Southern African-American voters. Stay with us.
Worn out places, worn out faces, bright and early for their daily races, going nowhere, going nowhere. Their tears are filling up their glasses, no expression, no expression. Hide my head, I wanna drown my sorrow. No tomorrow, no tomorrow. And I find it kind of funny, I find it kind of sad. The dreams in which I'm dying are the best I've ever had. I find it hard to tell you, I find it hard to take. When When people run in circles, it's a very, very...
It's performed by Gary Jules. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
We continue to look at Super Tuesday results, which established the fight for the Democratic nomination as largely a two-man race between Senator Bernie Sanders and former Vice President Joe Biden. Biden swept the South and the Midwest last night, winning Virginia, North Carolina, Arkansas, Alabama, Tennessee, Oklahoma, Massachusetts, Minnesota, and Texas, propelled by a huge majority of African-American votes in several states. And Sanders won in the West with victories in Colorado and Utah, and the grand prize of the night, California, with significant Latinx support. Sanders also won his home state of Vermont.
Biden's strong showing came after the Democratic Party establishment consolidated around the former vice president, with Amy Klobuchar and Pete Buttigieg dropping out in recent days and throwing their support behind him. But it also was due to black voters in the South who supported Biden by extremely significant margins. NBC reports Biden won the support of 63% of black voters in Virginia, 62% of black voters in Tennessee, and 72% of black voters in Alabama. Exit polls also show 6 in 10 black voters back Biden in Texas and North Carolina. According to an NBC exit poll, black voters outside the South were less likely to support Biden, and black voters under 45 are around 3 times as likely to support Bernie Sanders than older voters. Well, for more, we host a roundtable discussion. In Chicago, we're joined by Barbara Ransby, historian, author, and activist advisor to the Movement for Black Lives. She's endorsed Bernie Sanders for the Democratic nomination. Her latest book is Making All Black Lives Matter, Reimagining Freedom in the 21st Century. Reverend Dr. William Barber is with us in Washington, D.C., co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign and president of Repairers of the Breach. And via Democracy Now! Video stream, we're joined by Elie Mystal, the nation's justice correspondent and author of the magazine's new monthly column, Objection. His recent column is titled, Black Voters Didn't Vote for Biden in South Carolina Because They, quote, lack information. Welcome back to Democracy Now!, Elie. Elie, let us begin with you. Your response to what happened on Super Tuesday.
I think it's pretty amazing how much the black community in the South, the older black community, has really rallied behind Joe Biden. They have been with Biden from the start when it looked like he was shaky. It looked like they might even go to Mike Bloomberg, but they've all come back to Biden, and it's provided him a firewall that I am surprised that Bernie Sanders hasn't yet been able to break through, right? He's had 5 years to work on this problem. This is what happened to him in 2016 against Hillary Clinton. And I think it deserves serious analysis to try to figure out why his message is not impacting that community when he's had so long to work on it. I think your earlier guest, Chuck, he made a good point that Bernie seems to have made real inroads with the Latinx community, but that hasn't worked with the black community, hasn't worked with the Southern older black community specifically. And just to kind of cut people off at the pass, I think one thing that we can't say, one bad analysis that's out there, is that somehow Southern older blacks are just, well, more conservative. And so that's why they are. There is no evidence that Southern black voters are more socially conservative than other voters in this primary, when you look at the fact that all of the candidates running are basically in lockstep on the social issues, right? Like, all the candidates running support a woman's right to choose, all the candidates running support gay marriage, like all of the Democratic primary candidates are kind of in lockstep on the social issues. On the economic progressivism issues, again, black voters all across the country, including in the South, have a record of supporting economic progressivism, right? The Poor People's Campaign that Reverend Barber is running, like there is strong African-American support all across the South for economic progressivism. So what is it what part of Bernie's message is not translating to Southern black voters, I think is a really nuanced and interesting question.
Well, I'd like to bring Barbara Ransby into the discussion. And Barbara Ransby, specifically, there is an existing superstructure of black elected officials across the country who, for most of this campaign, were sort of divided in their perspective until, it seems to me, the South Carolina primary, and especially the pronouncements of Congressman Clyburn and his impact on the race in terms of it appeared to consolidate the existing superstructure of black elected officials around the country to turn out to vote. I'm wondering your perspective of what happened last night.
Yeah. No, I think that's a really a good point. But let me say this. The good news from last night was Bloomberg's defeat, in a sense. You know, the fear that Bloomberg could literally come in and buy black voters and other voters was a real fear. And so even with all his millions of investment, he didn't have the showing that he expected. So I think that's the good news and one important takeaway. I think in terms of black voters, you know, Ibram Kendi made the point last night in a tweet that we are talking about a subset of black voters. We are talking about older black voters, talking about primarily black voters in the South. And I think people vote for a lot of reasons. Most people are not, you know, reading every line of everyone's platform. And there's a lot of trust by association. So when Jim Clyburn comes in and gives his full weight behind Joe Biden, I think it did indeed have a ripple effect. I'm not saying that black voters in the South are not, you know, my relatives are in the South. I respect and have drawn wisdom from black folks in the South. My people come from the South. And my research is about the strength and fortitude and brilliant leadership of black Southerners in the black freedom movement. So absolutely no diss to black Southerners at all. But I think people are afraid, and I think our people voted more out of fear and pragmatism than out of hope and optimism, and we've got to turn that around. If you look at a Joe Biden versus a Bernie Sanders, both very imperfect. I am not looking for a savior in this election, but clearly down the line, looking at his past, looking at his platform, and looking at what he represents for the future, including young black activists who are excited about him, Bernie Sanders, hands down, is what black people need to be looking toward in terms of a campaign that can make a material impact on our lives and the lives of our people. So, you know, I think the race is not over. I think that there are a number of states still to be won and are in play. And I also think we have to recalibrate our notion of winning. For me, electoral politics is one part of a larger effort to further the cause of black freedom and justice in this country, for black people, for all people, and certainly sustainability for the planet. So this is one part of a larger agenda, a larger effort, a larger movement building. I think that's one of the things I have appreciated about the Sanders campaign, people like Phil Agnew and Nina Turner and others in that campaign who have a bigger vision of building a movement, not just winning an election, although hopefully we will win the election as well.
So, Reverend Barber, while you're in Washington right now, you're from North Carolina. That's where you live. The percentage points in your home state, 42% of the vote went to Biden. He, of course, won North Carolina, to Sanders' 24%. Why do you think former Vice President Biden did so well in North Carolina?
Well, first of all, good morning, and to your other guests. And yes, I'm a son of the South, and I'm certainly glad that we're finally having this conversation about the South, because you get over 160, almost 170 electoral votes just out of the former 13 Confederate states. And I'm glad we're having this conversation about African-American voters. Now, I'm on my way planning for June 20th, 2020, the Poor People's Assembly National Moral March on Washington. And I have a little bit different perspective living in the South all my life, working in the South. I've seen a lot of candidates on the Democratic side win primaries and read their primary numbers one way and then lose in the general election. So here's the question, Amy, and questions that I think we have to raise and that we're looking into this morning. First of all, the question is, when you say someone won 61% of the black vote, that's good. That should be celebrated. But what is that a percentage of? It's a percentage of those who voted. The other question is, how many weren't inspired to vote? How many weren't inspired to move? Yes, a lot of the initial vote may be based on personality, familiar, and Obama policies. And that's not a bad thing necessarily. But also we have to ask, in those states last night, those 14 states, there are over 40 million poor and low-wealth voters. Now, poor and low-wealth Americans did not support Donald Trump. What was the numbers of poor and low-wealth Americans in those states that turned out or didn't turn out? What didn't inspire them? Some places like Texas, you had 600,000, almost an even split between Sanders and Biden. That means that there is this split in the party and the soul for aspiration. How will the party deal with that? Because that is not some clear, far victory that dismisses, say, for instance, Sanders' policies as senseless, as silly as I've heard some Democrats say, and they have to be very careful with that. The last thing is not only who didn't vote, but in those southern states, we're talking about this black wall, but are the Dems really going to fight after the primaries? Are they going to really invest in the North Carolinas, the Georgias, the Mississippi, the Alabama, Virginia, after the primaries in the general elections? Because, in the general election, oftentimes we see something very different. For instance, last time in the Clinton campaign, they left 500,000 African-American voters off the table. There was really no real effort to go after. And in all of those states, the number of poor and low wealth people and the number of African Americans who didn't vote held the political calculus to not elect Donald Trump. They could have fundamentally changed. And I want to know, are we really seriously now going to focus on the South and focus on bringing together poor blacks and poor whites in the South? Now, if that happens, we can have a fundamental shift in political calculus in this country. You could see states like Virginia, North Carolina, Georgia, Mississippi, Florida flip in the general election. But if we're just going to deal with primary now and who gets the primary vote and not look deeper, who didn't vote, who wasn't inspired, and why, and how many black people were left on, how many poor people were left out last night, and why, then we might end up with a lot of excitement in the primary and a lot of sobbing and sadness in the general election.
I wanted to bring Elie Mystal back into the conversation. In a recent column in The Nation, you laid out why you thought black voters are opting for Biden, and you said that it's not because they lack information. Why do you think so many turned out for Biden, even though understanding, as Reverend Barber says, this is a primary, it's not as representative of an overall subset or part of the population as a general election?
I think you have to look at black voters, and I think this links up exactly with what Reverend Barber is saying. Who is going to be for black voters in the future, and are the policies that Bernie Sanders is running on, which I personally think are the right policies for our community and lots of other communities. Are white Americans ready to vote for those policies and uplift all people and share the great wealth of this country? Because the answer historically has been no. The answer historically has been that when you ask white people to share the wealth of this country, they say no. They vote with their pocketbooks over their morality. That is how you get an unvarnished bigot and open sexist in the White House over a highly qualified woman, right? So that's what white people did in 2016. We have seen this. We've seen the white electorate go for the Republican nominee time and time and time again. Bernie Sanders is out here telling us that white people are ready to vote for real economic redistribution and change. And I don't know that he has convinced black people that white people are ready to do that. So I don't think that it's fear exactly. I think it is pragmatism. I think that if you don't feel like you have white allies willing to take this plunge with you, well, then you revert back to the most important thing as beating Donald Trump, and that's how you get back to Biden. Now, one thing I will say, and again, I think this links up, Reverend Barber is saying is so important. You can start to change this if you continue to invest in the South, because it's not just in terms of your own presidential campaign. We have people running in the South in the Senate that we desperately need to take back and we desperately need to support. Don't leave Jamie Harrison out there, hanging out there. Jamie Harrison, by the way, seems to support Joe Biden. Don't leave Tom Tillis' seat out there. Don't leave those 2 seats in Georgia out there. Like if the top of the ticket reinvests in these southern states, not only will it help them win the Senate, that's the kind of thing that I think long-term impresses African-American voters, that white people are ready to be allies to the cause of social justice and racial equality.
Historian Barbara Ransby, you were among more than 100 leading black scholars, writers, educators, including Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor, Mark Lamont Hill, Gerald Horne, who issued a joint letter endorsing Bernie Sanders this weekend. Can you talk about specifically, simply, why you believe Senator Sanders should be president and would most benefit African Americans in this country, not to mention all Americans?
Right. I'm glad you brought up that ad that we did. We did a statement. There were over 100 black scholars, people who have devoted their entire lives to not only studying but standing with the black freedom movement, people who come out of the black freedom movement and out of black communities. And our assessment is, look, I grew up in Detroit, a working class family. For me, issues of race and class have always been intimately bound up. And I think while, sometimes I'm disappointed, quite frankly, that Bernie Sanders doesn't lead with a racial justice analysis. But when I listen carefully and when I look at the policies, I see a way forward for black working class people. As an educator, many of my students are first generation college. They're black and Latinx students. They're deeply, deeply in debt. The $1.6 trillion student debt is of serious concern to all of us who are educators. And that is a very racialized, racially imbalanced debt falling heavily on people of color, young people of color. Bernie Sanders' commitment to prison reform, to enfranchising incarcerated citizens. I mean, all these things are elements of a progressive vision for the future. And this thing about white voters, listen, you've got racism's everywhere in this country. It's ubiquitous, right? So you have racist white people who voted for Barack Obama. You've got racist white people who voted for Elizabeth Warren in this primary. You've got racist white people who voted for Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden. So people vote for a complex set of reasons, and we're not all going to be on the same page in that. And I think what we have to look at is what are the candidates' commitments, right, around issues of race, and what are the candidates' commitments particularly around poor and working class people. I think the work that Reverend Barber's doing with the Poor People's Campaign is so important, but also coalitions like the Rising Majority that are looking at a range of issues as they impact the lives of black people. All of this is in the mix when we assess what presidential candidate could best lead us into a brighter, more just and sustainable future. And for us, that candidate is Bernie Sanders. But it's not just Bernie Sanders as a man, as a person. I reserve the right to critique everybody, including people who I love and respect. But it's the campaign that he is building. Again, it's people like Chokwe Lumumba in Mississippi who endorsed him. It's people like Senator Nina Turner. It's people like Phil Agnew, brilliant young organizer from Florida you've had on the show, who was very much a part of the early Black Lives Matter movement and the movement for Black Lives, deeply respected among a whole ecosystem of young black activists. So those are the principles that we united around when we formed the statement. And the statement involved a lot of discussion and debate and push and pull about what tone did we want to strike. Why was it important for us to do so as educators and all of that. And so, I hope it's gotten some traction, but we are certainly not alone. I think the young organizers in the Dream Defenders, the organization that Phil Agnew comes out of, their 501c4, did endorse Bernie Sanders as well. So there are a number of black organizers, activists, educators who see in the Sanders campaign, in the people around him like AOC, like Ilhan Omar, like Rashida Tlaib, a real hope for a different kind of politic. But again, for us, for me, I would say, it is really a vote plus strategy. I agree with Reverend Barber that this doesn't end at the primary and can't end at the primaries, but it also can't end in November. We have to be about building a movement, and I think what Bernie Sanders' campaign represented, but also what Elizabeth Warren's campaign represented, that a joining of forces there really represents a hopeful growth of a movement, a multiracial and anti-racist movement for a justice agenda long term.
Reverend Barber, I'd like to ask you, you tweeted recently that the Dems also need to think about how they keep saying the black vote is the heart of the party, yet when they had a chance to include blacks on the stage, they didn't fight for that, but changed the rules for a billionaire. Your thoughts in terms of the party's two-faced strategy when it comes to the African-American vote, and especially how they treated Kamala Harris or Cory Booker versus how they opened the doors up for Michael Bloomberg?
Well, you know, I've been a part of two campaigns that have actually won in the South, one in Kentucky and Moral Mondays in North Carolina. And I learned that when you address systemic racism, systemic poverty, ecological devastation, the war economy, and the false moral narrative of religious nationalism, you can, in fact, bring black and poor and low-wealth white and black people and Latinos together, and you can make significant change. We have a study coming out now that shows if you just organize 2 to 10% of poor and low-wealth black, white, and Latino people in the country, not just in the South, but significantly in the South, you could fundamentally change elections. We have to talk about that, and it's not so much race or class, but it's race and class. I've challenged, for instance, Bernie Sanders and all of the Biden, all of them, as my sister said, to lead with a race analysis, but not about culture, but about real issues, and to deal with the issue of poverty and low wealth. 61% of African Americans live in poverty and low wealth. That's 26 million people. 30-some% of white people live in poverty and low wealth. That's 66 million people. We will never have a political transformation in the calculus in this country until we deal with the issue of poverty. 140 million people, 43% of this nation. Now, the issue of how we're treating African Americans. There's all this talk about the African Americans are the heart of the party. They're the firewall. They're different things. Well, where was all the fervor to ensure that African Americans stayed on the stage? That's an interesting issue. And if we are the heart, and if 61% of African Americans are poor and low wealth, why are most candidates only talking about, if they talk about poverty, they do in the Democrats, they use a pseudonym. Republicans racialize poverty, Democrats run from poverty. We talk about the working class, but not poverty. We looked at the issue of poverty in these states, and we said that the number of people who are poor and low wealth in the Super Tuesday states, in the former Confederate state, far outweigh any margin of victory in Senate races or in presidential race. Why are we scared to say the issue? We will never move people until they hear themselves. So here's what I want to put out. If this is a serious conversation about African-American people, then why not every candidate put in writing how will their candidate in the future, not what they've done in the past, in the future, deal with the wealth gap? How will it close the wealth gap? How will it deal with the health care gap? How will they deal with racist voter suppression and gerrymandering and expanding access to the ballot? How will they deal with the disparate ecological issues in our communities? How will they deal with militarization in our communities? How will they deal with mass incarceration, resegregation of public schools? How will they increase the number of African Americans in the federal court appointees and increase the number of African Americans in the Senate? And what is the strategy to go after the Senate that is truly holding up progress for poor and low wealth people of every race, creed, and color? Put it in writing and then change the next debate to be about nothing but the issue of systemic racism and poverty, and not just how racism affects black people, but how it undermines the democracy. For instance, every state that is a racist voter suppression state is also a state where once the people who use racist voter suppression get elected, they then block policies of living wages, block policies of health care, and end up hurting more white people in terms of raw numbers than black people. So let's have a full, thoroughgoing debate on these issues. Every candidate needs to say, now, if my policies, this is how it's going to impact the black community. This is how it's going to impact the rural community. This is how it's going to impact the Latino community. Let's move deep, deep, deep into policy and put that out there. And I believe if that happened, you would not just see a percentage of black votes turning out that then folks say, well, they got 60% of a vote that may have been only 40% of the total black population, but we will see an increase in the number of participation and a building of alliances. But I also know, finally, the political system is not going to do that. It's going to take a movement, and that's why the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, is engaged.
Reverend Dr. William Barber, I want to thank you for being with us with the Poor People's Campaign from North Carolina. Historian Barbara Ransby speaking to us from Illinois, and Elie Mystal of The Nation. When we come back, we speak with the author of Yesterday's Man, the case against Joe Biden. Stay with us. of the thumping by Chumbawamba. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
Well, we end today's show with a closer look at the comeback candidate of Super Tuesday, former Vice President Joe Biden, who won 9 states, including delegate-rich Texas, while the AP reports Bernie Sanders won the largest prize of the night, California.
For more, we go to Toronto, Canada, where we're joined by Branko Marcetic, staff writer at Jacobin Magazine, reporter at In These Times, author of a new book called Yesterday's Man, The Case Against Joe Biden. He may not be yesterday's man after Super Tuesday, Branko. Can you talk about why you wrote a book on Joe Biden and what you think it's most important to understand about him?
Biden very early, when he announced, it was clear he was going to end up being the front runner. Obviously, he was not only the vice president, sort of traditional passing the torch from the previous popular president, and that he was inheriting that popular support, but also he was a guy similar to Clinton in 2016 who has a lot of intra-party support. I felt if people are going to vote, they should probably be aware of his record, particularly African-American voters, who I argue in the books Biden has really systematically betrayed, even though he's gained their support, year after year, election after election. I think the main thing that people need to know about Biden is his approach to politics, which is very much based on his 1978 re-election campaign, which came at the sort of conservative shift in U.S. politics. Is based on appeasing the right and sort of taking the platform of his Republican opponent and trying to make it his own and kind of siphon away support like that. And that's really been the case in every election and really how he's governed. So that's why in the 80s and the 90s you see Biden going actually further on the tough on crime and tough on drugs messaging than even Reagan and Bush were calling for. Biden was constantly saying that they were not going far enough. He was pushing for a drug czar when Reagan and even Rudy Giuliani, if you can imagine it, was saying such an idea was insane. Pushing for expansion of civil forfeiture and that kind of thing. And in the 90s, you see him, even though he says in 1995, he claims, I'm close to retiring, but the thing that has made me stay in the race is I want to defeat these guys. I want to defeat the Gingrich Republicans that came in 94. These guys are terrible. And what does he do? In 1996, he passes welfare reform, which was defined by Senate Republican Majority Leader Trent Lott as the, quote, holy grail of the GOP's legislative agenda. Welfare kind of disappears really across the South and the Southwest United States as conservative governors use that welfare reform to basically just use the money to plug up their own budgets. He passes NAFTA. He repeals Glass-Steagall. He partners with Clinton to try and cut spending and to cut the federal bureaucracy. Spending and federal employment goes down to pre-1960s levels, even before to levels before Roosevelt took power. And this is really the way it's always been. Part of the reason why he ended up being the architect, the Democratic architect of the Iraq War was he was worried about an election. He was worried about being challenged from the right in 2002 by an opponent who could rival him in fundraising. And his safe bet was to sort of go and support the Iraq War, which a lot of African-Americans did not support. And in fact, Biden, talking to a group of African-American columnists shortly, a month after voting for the war, and this is a classic Biden thing, is he votes for something and he says to this mostly black audience, he says, well, I think actually the war is a terrible idea and I don't want it. I don't think it's going to happen. Saddam and al-Qaeda are not in cahoots at all. That's ridiculous.
We have 10 seconds.
When, of course, he had been saying the exact opposite before. So this is, as the Republican Party gets more and more extreme to the right, having Biden as president and even going up against Trump is a real worry.
Well, we're going to do part 2, post online at democracynow.org. Branko Marcetic is staff writer at Jacobin Magazine, In These Times reporter. His new book, Yesterday's Man, The Case Against Joe Biden. And that does it for our show. If you'd like to see our 5-hour Super Tuesday broadcast, go to democracynow.org. We have a number of job openings here in our New York studio, from our newsroom to outreach and development, information application deadlines at democracynow.org. Democracy Now! Is produced by Mike Burke, Dina Guzman, Nermeen Sheikh, Carla Wills, Tammy Warrenoff, Libby Rainey, Sam Alcoff, John Hamilton, Robbie Karen, Honey Masood, Trina Durek, Tay Marie Astudio, Julie Crosby. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. Thanks so much for joining us.